I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe what happened, what we can learn from these sorts of experiences, and all that jazz, and how to avoid, at least maybe not TPKs necessarily, but at least avoid doing it the wrong way, I guess. So I run a Spelljammer session. So if you don't know what Spelljammer is, it's basically like Dungeons and Dragons in space. There's the rules for space are a little bit different. It's more like what people thought space was than what space actually is. Like they used to think that there was these crystal spheres that were suspended in the sky, and basically in Spelljammer, different solar systems are suspended in these spheres, and the spheres are within this fiery river called the Phlogiston, which you have to travel through to get from sphere to sphere, which is very dangerous. And also gravity's not the same. It's like one plane, and like you're either on the top or the bottom. Like it's just all sorts of crazy stuff. Like it's like actual like boats and galleons that are flying in space, not like spaceships. So it has like that still medieval aspect with some steampunk. And so far it's been going great. In the past, I've had some railroady campaigns, and this one was a nice change of pace. I gotta give my players a lot of choices. It was, just basically go with the planets you want, and there's stuff going on in this bigger world, and you can choose what you want to be a part of, and you can, and basically kind of explore as much of it as you want. And so I had a lot of fun with that, just designing the world, even if maybe kind of coming to terms with the fact that my players wouldn't necessarily get to see all of it. And they still did a good job in working with my world and their backstories. And I was really happy because some of those players don't always, in previous sessions, maybe didn't have a fully fleshed out backstory. But I was very happy about everything that was going on. And also I really got to mess around with more like homebrew enemies, and I felt like this world was more my own. And I feel like they had fun getting to explore that, and I got to fun running it and kind of directing it and seeing what kind of happened. And it was a smaller session. There was originally supposed to be more players, but they didn't show, so it was a nice group size. And we were able to meet quite regularly. But I had a TPK, so that apparently all changed. If any of you follow Matthew Colville, you know about skill challenges, which are basically where you have to have a certain amount of successes. You can make any skill check as long as it justifies. So basically, they were in the forest, so they could make a survival check to try to follow like tracks or whatever, nature check to kind of use the natural environment to kind of defer clues about where to go, kind of feel like the which way the wind is and follow the stars or whatever. They could make a perception check to kind of view around or investigation or something to see if they found like tracks or evidence or whatnot. One of the characters actually did a two-part skill check. They first made a perception to see if they could find a village, and then they made a intimidation to scare those villagers to telling them where to go. So they had a lot of fun with it, and it's fun to watch them see where kind of that's going to end up. One of the players actually made a performance check to increase the morale so that they wouldn't be as like frustrated or hungry or exhausted. And so you had different stuff like that, and they had quite a few failures, unfortunately, even though they did some cool stuff, didn't all work out. And so they had a few encounters. There was some quicksand, there was thick vines, and finally they made it to the battle. Now, the last battle they had was actually too weak for them, so I kind of experimented a little bit around with that. But there's various reasons why. First of all, they had basically an exact item to counteract the main bad guy's ability. Then they also had the advantage of sneaking up on their enemies, and one of the characters was an assassin rogue, so they really went off. And this was a little bit different. Then I didn't have a surprise attack per se, but the creatures, which were dinosaurs, ended up battling the players, and I was expecting them to take out the smaller dinosaurs first because they had like a monk on their team, so they could, you know, easily have a lot of attacks and beat off a lot of these smaller, weaker enemies, so that they wouldn't have as much as action economy on them. But no, they went on the main, which I was not expecting. And so he gotta use some of his main abilities a lot earlier than I thought he would, which were pretty devastating. I think I overestimated the power. First of all, that they had so much action economy on the players, even though the smaller enemies had an atrocious to hit, and my players had very high AC. It was terrible, but what ended up happening is that once they went down, you have all these enemies on them, and they're gonna just, you know, slam into their death saves, and these creatures are mindless. They don't take hostages. I apologize for the setup of this video. It's a bit impromptu, and I want to kind of get it out while I still had those kind of fresh feelings on my mind. But this is definitely a temporary type thing. I might try more discussions like this, but this is the first that would just be me talking about what just happened. The group was a bit smaller than it normally was because not all the group could make it, but there was still 4 people, and there's normally like 4 or 5, because there's like 6 people in the group. So I didn't expect this to be a huge issue, especially because 2 of the players were really good at building strong characters. Literally, in my past campaign, I had a really hard time balancing encounters, because if one of those 2 players was there, then they could really help swing the tide of that battle, and they could even take on enemies that were way powerful than they were. But when they weren't, and it was just the other players, the encounters were very unbalanced. And so I'd find this weird mix. Like, I would beef up the stats of very low CR monsters. My players will always remember the infamous piranha attack, where a flood had come in from the city. And don't ask me why I decided to put piranhas in ocean water opposed to fresh water, but I did. And I wasn't expecting it to be a difficult encounter, but how it was set up is that the players didn't have a lot of options, because I thought maybe they'd be in the water or in the buildings or not, but they ended up outside of one of the buildings and basically were just on a tensor's floating disc. And they were avoiding ranged attacks from the buildings. They had, or staying out of the way of the piranhas from down below, and it was just a lot to handle at once. And I don't think it was an enjoyable encounter. I don't think water encounters ever are, which is, it's a lesson, which I threw at them again because the piranhas was such a big repeated joke that I had to. And out of spite, they used a tensor's floating disc to lift the piranha out of the water, and because the piranha had 0 walking speed, it could do nothing. I designed so much into this piranha. It was basically, those fish in Nemo that can form like different, Sydney's over there, and they form different shapes and whatever. I did kind of like that, where the Piranha King had these piranhas that could like form into a whip, or they could form around it to make a bigger piranha. It's like, oh, the players are gonna love this. They didn't like that. They ate well that night after burning the remains with a fireball spell. I used a normal dinosaur, but that was also pretty powerful. It made only 2 attacks, but it was the Tyrannosaurus Rex that was slightly bumped up. Like, its legendary actions were already a little bit more powerful, because it was the altered stats from one of the plane shift manuals, I think. So it had 2 attacks, but one was a bite attack and dealt 5d12 damage. And one of the players went down almost instantly after having a crit hit by the Tyrannosaurus Rex. So, and it rolled really high. There was like a 12, so that becomes 24, 9, that becomes 18. It was ridiculous. So it was bad. It was really good rolls on the side of the enemies. The players had really bad health rolls. The healer pooled in third level cure wounds, which did almost nothing. Greater healing potion, like minimum healing. Like, things were not going well for the players. And our healer, which is normal, our tank, had taken massive damage. And once the healer's looking bad, things aren't going to go well. Partially, I really wanted Retribution, which is kind of my bad in feeling kind of antagonistic towards when the Assassin Rogue character, because they could deal so much damage, and they were also a Warlock, so they had invisibility, so they would get that crit ability twice in one round. Fortunately, normally the Assassin Rogue really takes advantage of this, but partially because I restricted it and because of an interesting decision on his part, he decided to not use his first attack as a crit on the main bad guy, but on one of the weaker dinosaurs. That also helped turn the tides on the enemy's favor, and also because he had recently gotten a invisibility ring for a pretty good price, because it was on this planet called Weavesfar. On Weavesfar, the weave just in general was more powerful, so you can cast first level spells like their cantrips, and second level spells using first level spell slots, and so on and so on. So like, when this ring was taken off Weavesfar, it couldn't really work without pulling in one of his own spell slots, which made him reluctant to use that, because he's a Warlock, only has 2 of those, and which also kind of meant he didn't use his ability as much, and also the Tyrannosaur used his legendary action to scare the players, so he was invisible and didn't want to waste that invisibility on a disadvantaged attack, so kind of counteracting what would make the players handle this encounter kind of was taken away from them. And I feel like if you want to challenge the players, you either 1, scale the encounter, or 2, counteract their abilities. You don't do both, which I learned the hard way. I felt bad for one of the players, especially because he had made his kind of own mush of class. It was kind of like, had a lot of options, kind of similar to the Battle Master, but it was a gunslinger, kind of like the fighter gunslinger, and it had a mess of different like customization options, and he only got to use that about twice because he had a really busy summer and wasn't able to attend that many sessions, which I felt bad about, that his character died. Assassin Rogue's character kind of ran into combat, was reckless, so he wasn't sure how long his character was going to last either. I should have allowed him to be able to make the best of his character while he still had him, which I didn't, at least in this last encounter. So I guess if anyone has an experience like this, the one when designing the encounter, do one, not the other. Either play against your character's strengths or really scale the enemies. Don't do both. And I feel like one of the abilities that I gave, so I'll probably talk about this in its own video, but I really like taking inspiration from other sources for my custom enemies. Things like Link Spin Attack from Legend of Zelda can easily be incorporated into an enemy. And this particular enemy, I took inspiration from Rakan and Zaya from League of Legends. Basically, you know how they can like release feathers and recall them. Zaya particularly, I think. Well, basically, this is kind of what that dinosaur could do. He had shards all along his back, and the mini enemies, the Velociraptor type enemies, had shards on them too. And basically, when they died, they released a few shards, and when they attacked, if they missed, then it would just land a shard on the ground. So I had tons of shards all over the battlefield, and singular shards didn't do that much, but when combined, they could be devastating. Because what happened is that the Tyrannosaur could recall all the shards on the battlefield, and they each made like individual attacks. I did this differently from a normal saving throw, where I basically had this tool where I could, if you just look up like Google dice roll and just press D20 10 times, then I showed all the ones. It's like, oh, okay, that hit, and then every time it hit, it would deal like D6 damage. So it didn't do that much, but I think I crit an unnatural amount of times, and I probably made it a little bit too powerful. I feel often I like to scale down opposed to scale up, which can be a bit of a problem. I'd like to hear from some other experiences to see what works best. Like if you're doing an encounter and the enemy, is it good to make the enemy weaker before combat or stronger? I think it's probably better to do weaker, which I don't do, and then always scale it up, opposed to what I do, which is make them powerful and I can always scale down. Because I feel like that can have some bad consequences, especially if the players have seen what kind of damage they have done in the past. So I guess so far the things to go over is, one, it's probably better to scale up than scale down. Oh, I can always add hit points to my enemy. The players won't know. If my players are watching this, I'm not saying I do this, or do I, but you know, it's just that simple. They don't know how many hit points they have. I mean, you could say it's bloodied, but it's still not exact. Or, you know, you can give them some sort of uncanny dodge ability or something. Or some, like, resistances. I'd given my players hard encounters in the past. There was this one encounter where it was only one enemy, though. But basically, he had ability to steal some of the players' abilities, like Action Surge and Channel Divinity. And so they would do some of their really powerful abilities, and he'd gain that, which it worked out because there was enough players, and it was only one enemy. So they had, even though he had enough attacks to kind of keep the action economy going, it was still balanced. And I had one enemy alone who probably would have been able to take the party. I had probably about 6 more Velociraptors helping him out, which really kind of set the unfortunate tone for this battle. When you're scaling down, things can be a little bit difficult. You can't get rid of HP necessarily. I mean, you can, but it's usually easier both mentally and just mechanically to add than subtract. If a enemy is not hitting, you can just always increase their hit bonus to make it not seem like a slog. I feel like also players don't like it when the encounters are too weak. They like to have a challenge. But they like the challenge to be interesting. I feel like if it's just a, hit, or, something mechanical, then the players won't like it as much, or no matter the strength or weakness, but they like encounters to be interesting, to have a lot of things going on the map, and I feel like that's where I've succeeded in past attempts, like the one I was talking about. It was this creature called the Winged Babaloo, and that was what stole the player's abilities. It would fly up onto these tall sort of pillars to avoid attacks from the melee combatants, and then other times it would fly into water and attack from there to give disadvantage on the ranged players. So it was kind of this back and forth, and the melee fighters had to find a way to get up there or still be useful in combat, which I think made things really interesting. Also, again, it's all according to your players. If your players are those kind of players who maybe like slaughtering the enemies and having them be a lot weaker, then yeah, you can do that. Or if they like a really big challenge, and they'll accept the fact that they might have a TPK. But if you do have a TPK, you don't want your players to feel cheated. Like sometimes maybe there's some sort of learning experience that the players could have taken away, like, oh, if we had done this strategy or whatever, then things might have gone differently. And if they were reckless, and if this counter was forecasted as being such, and they went into that knowing that, that's different. But in this case, it was something I threw on the players. I mean, they could have ran away, but in past encounters, things hadn't been like that. It hadn't been where I said, oh, this is always an option, or it's been something in the past. In the past, they've always fought and won, so that was their normal approach and strategy, which if I was a player, I would have done the same. Again, this is just a rant, things I'm saying after this experience happened to me. If any one of you has had this sort of experience, please let me know how you handled it, because I would love to know your thoughts, because this is something that probably all DMs and players eventually end up going through, some sort of death that was unexpected and maybe not deserved, and how do you deal with that. I think, especially in the place of a TPK, where it wasn't particularly one adventurer who died, but the whole party, some players might feel okay to do new characters and some may not. I think it's okay to have a little bit of inequality, especially if it can make sense. Like maybe if the cleric died, their deity may give them one last chance at life, or something I think based off of what your party's okay with, to make it seem at least better narratively. But if your party is really against being cheated, no matter if it was your fault, you're gonna have to do the hard thing. And I love rooting for my players. I love giving them hard encounters and seeing them get over it. But you gotta bite the bullet. They gotta bite the bullet. And especially if that's what they want, you're gonna have to go through with TPK. And it's not gonna feel good normally if you're like me and have that mindset. And the scenario was in a way that probably made it, the DM's fault. But retconning is not going to do any goods for anyone. You're not going to feel good about it. So you just need to give everyone time to let off some steam. That's probably what's best in any sort of scenario like that, whether it be player death or TPK or some other thing that went wrong. And there's always like a different outcome in some scenarios. Unlike what I ran, if actual intelligent creatures are involved in the battle, they could have arrested them instead. Maybe that was part of the plan, but in this case, that was not an option. And if I did that or something like that, players definitely would have felt cheated. So I'd say to take what may have been the easy, may have been the hard way out. For me, I definitely would have enjoyed more giving the players a chance at life, but I realized I couldn't do that. I owed it to them. If I'd done this to them, I better go all the way through with it. So yeah. And of course, the players who weren't involved, they'll still be alive. It would be unfair to punish them for the decisions of the other players. I mean, it's not like their decisions necessarily were the things that should be punished, but coming back and suddenly hearing that your character is dead, that's not how I run things. And probably not how a lot of DMs run things either. So this is definitely a learning experience, and I hope that those out there can learn from my terrible mistake. I hope that people out there watching can reflect and learn from the mistakes that have been made, that I've just expressed, and maybe take some insight from this. I feel like failure is one of the greatest teachers, which is why I'm excited to see what comes of this. Being able to deal with this challenge will ultimately make me a better DM and avoid this in the future. So I'm excited to see kind of how I can work with the players in order to get things settled out and put their new characters into the campaign. I really love this campaign, and it's not going to stop because of a TPK. The players love the world, and I love leading them into it. I feel like always having an optimistic mind, if you can, really helps, because there is a good in all scenarios. It's a learning experience. Gosh, this is heavy. Not the water. Well, I gave my thoughts. There is still a little bit of an interpretation. If you see my experience and have a different outcome of what to take away, that's a thing too. I'm not saying that's wrong. It probably is better than how I'm dealing with it or how I plan to change things in the future and help. Well, I wouldn't wish and would wish this on every DM. This experience definitely was not pleasant, but it was good that I had this experience, because now I know how to deal with it. I think I've really grown as a DM from this experience, and I think it's also a rite of passage for a DM to go through this. So for all you DMs out there, I hope you can learn from my mistakes, so hopefully maybe you don't have to make the same one yourself. It's also an apology to my players. I'm sorry. The encounter I threw at you, which I took a lot of pride in making, I had not thought of the players first. I've thought about me and my own creations. I wanted the enemies to seem cool, not the players, both stifling what makes each character individual by countering their effects, as well as heightening the power level of the enemies in order to increase that difficulty, creating an unfun and eventually a encounter that resulted in a TPK. I apologize, but I've definitely learned from this experience, as you can see from the video, and I hope that the future of Spelljammer has more good memories than bad. I really enjoyed this campaign, and I think one of the best parts is that it did happen in a campaign that I did really like, because it makes that one more memorable. Now let's give a moment of silence for those who were affected by this TPK. First is Bags, the Blue Kobold, multi-class Hexblade, Warlock, and Assassin Rogue. The nameless Mod Podge of a class, Simic Hybrid, that only was in 2 sessions, who had an unfortunate and premature burial. Rodran, the human Tempest cleric who worshipped Talos. He was our tank as well as our healer. I think he had the highest hit points of any character, as well as one of the highest ACs and damage output, but also kept the party alive. So when he went down, he and the spirit of the party went down as well. And finally, Silglad, the Monk Chateau. I think I might have something still planned for Silglad. This was actually his planet that he had the unfortunate tragedy on. We'll see. I'll have to talk more with the players, but I'm definitely excited to see what awaits with the new characters and how to all put this together. And like in past campaigns, not everyone had backstory worked out. And so it is unfortunate that we won't get to see those backstories completed. Bags especially. Rodran, his new character, I think might actually know Rodran, so there might be some room for backstory there. I'm interested to see maybe if there's some sort of memorial service or whatever for the characters, how that will go down. So next session will definitely not be one I planned on having on the agenda, but that's what D&D's about. It's improv. That's what I love so much about improv and Dungeons & Dragons. And it's one of the reasons that got me into this game, the role-playing and the improv, and kind of the fact that it's unexpected, and like life. It reminds me of actually in E.T. they play improv.
Dungeons and Dragons.
And during which the mother asks the players, how do you win? Where Elliot's older brother responds, it's like life. You don't win. But just because you don't win doesn't mean you don't try, which is why I'm excited for the next campaign. I don't really have a outro plan, so I'll just kind of do a hodgepodge of maybe random D&D YouTubers I know. Look in the doobly-doo. Is it Thursday yet? Easy roller dice. Because we have to pay our bills. Like an adult. Yeah, there's a reason why I only have 10 subscribers and 3 of them are me.